And of course, sadness has a particularly debilitating quality and experience of apartheid. But that he says, and I quote, but there is, I wish to argue, a trope of sadness that is so unstable as to be rendered repressed as a feature of the South African psyche. In this sadness, I believe we may find the resources to craft what is specific to the desire to overcome apartheid. A further framework before we kind of kick off was for me to start thinking about exactly what does this mean for public culture. And perhaps I want to just quickly talk about a certain kind of theatrics, I guess, that has kind of manifested how public culture has manifested. And if we take this discourse further in this idea, could we perhaps see protest as a manifestation of that, as some kind of performance? Perhaps could we talk about the spectacle of violence, the spectacle of homophobia, or the political as a stage with state-sanctioned police brutality? I think it also comes something that resonated through many of our conversations earlier today in Marikana, what happened there and how that has been processed. But I also want to think about public culture perhaps as a series of flashpoints where these kind of things kind of coalesce, bump up against each other, and what happens in that space. And then perhaps on another level, if we can talk about kind of public space, to kind of think about social media as a very, I think, interesting place for conversations, whether it's political. Of course, it's also kind of like bogged down by, I think, kind of a very vacuous celebrity culture. But I think there also, again, are very interesting moments where celebrities has engaged in larger political conversations. And within social media, if we think about the accessibility of this, one small statistic is that there's a cell phone penetration in South Africa of 141%. It means that many people have more than one phone. There's mobility, there's social media like Mixit, who doesn't require smartphones, are very active. But I think perhaps not only on Facebook necessarily, but Twitter, how this kind of publicness kind of manifests itself. And of course then, within social media, and we also find lurking in the comment sections of news platforms like news24.com, kind of, I don't kind of call it a conversation about race, but perhaps kind of where the ugly head of racism finds its most kind of public visibility. So I'm going to just kick off with a question to Khalo. If we think about what is public, we also have to infer what is not public or what is not seen. What happens away from the public eye on one side, but also kind of notions of erasure, of things that's been taken away. And with that also idea of amnesia. Your work has, the most recent work, film on Mandela, for example, really interrogates this notion of forgiveness. And perhaps what is left unsaid and unspoken and invisible. Can you respond to that?
I'm waiting for the question.
I knew you were going to do that.
Okay, so
yeah.
What's the question?
No, the question is...
Come on. So... yeah, so now I have to formulate the question myself. I think, you know, what is interesting, I think, when after I did the Mandela documentary, and I went to the Chicken Film Festival for something else, completely different. And this year, and I ran into the head of our National Film and Video Foundation and the chairperson. And they had never met me before. They didn't even know me. They just like, of course, know them. They knew the name and everything. And I don't even think they'd seen my work at all. And then they decided they were to watch the documentary, and I said to them, you know, I'm not sure how you're going to react, because you know they've got such close relationship with the state, you know. And they came out, and I was very surprised that the chairperson actually posted a message on Facebook saying how much he loved the film, and that this is the kind of discussions that are happening at dinner tables, and people don't talk. You know, that people never really say this publicly, especially about Madiba, you know. And I think it's starting to happen now when people talk, you know. But I think, you know, one of the things that I found fascinating when you're talking about Facebook and everything else is that, you know, the people that I follow on Facebook and on Twitter, I'm just sticking to those people so that it doesn't become a factual thing and you can question me. What I found interesting is that when the elections were happening and everyone thought, those people on my social networks, who most of them consider themselves to be intellectuals and critical and a bit on the left, you know, they're talking about how the ANC is going to get like less than 60%, something is going to happen radically, you know? And it's fascinating because they always lose. And it was the second time that I had, you know, even when the thing was happening in, the conference was happening in Northwest, and I had all those kind of things. So I keep on saying to myself, you know, this is very interesting that these friends that I have, I'm speaking to the people that are the friends that I have, okay, and on Twitter and Facebook. So that's quite an interesting thing, you know, that's quite an interesting element, I think, of like, because sometimes I think what is supposed to be perception or what's supposed to be fact, because you know some things comes across as fact, but they're actually what we're feeling at that time. The feeling of frustration against this government that's sometimes not delivering, that's taking people for granted. And you somehow think that's universal, it relates to the whole country, you know? And also what was interesting, and I'm going to try to be short, what was interesting is that on the day of the elections, one of the DJs called DJ Screw took a photograph of himself voting for the ANC and put it on Twitter. Okay? And it disturbed me a bit because I also knew it wasn't I love the ANC. I knew what that meant. It meant the president, the ANC, I support you. And you know, when you've got things, I'm gonna be the guy who's singing. You're gonna give me all the deals, everything else that comes with it. You know, and I found it revolting actually, honestly speaking. And there was another DJ Coffee, Black Coffee, you know, and then I see he said on Twitter that he was going to perform in Israel, and everyone else was like, oh, that's amazing, whatever. I wrote and said, come on, Jude, like, what century do you live in, you know, and so that's really interesting. I think this kind of interaction that happens with Twitter, sometimes it's very superficial, sometimes it's very, you know, especially when Pumla says stuff on Facebook. It's quite interesting. But in general, I think that, you know, there is this kind of, it's quite an interesting kind of thing. But also, you know, we recently, there was a thing of a businessman in South Africa who apparently had an affair, and you know, with these things you have to say apparently, because this thing. So, and the young lover, allegedly, okay, I grew up in a rural area, so Sepedi is my first language. So they had it was interesting. The young woman who supposedly he was meant to keep her and give her money and everything else, and it went wrong, started posting stuff, pictures of his own private parts on Twitter. And it was quite an interesting thing, you know, like completely visible. I'm not talking about a mirror image, like completely. And he sent them to him and said, do you remember this time? You know, and it was quite an interesting thing. So since you didn't ask me a question, I'm just going off.
I mean, to come back, okay, so I'll try and pin you down. I think for me, there's a question in a way that you're asking with the film on a kind of an absence of something. And if it is perhaps the absence of expressing anger, what was that search for you? Can you be more explicit about this? In terms of the work, you know, there's a question that you ask. You know, kind of what
you mean for the Mandela?
Yeah, yeah. And also, what does forgiveness mean? I mean, there's a real.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that, I mean, I grew up with the notion of forgiveness. My grandparents were very strong on that. They were Methodists, you know. We went to church on Sundays. This idea of forgiveness was really enforced on me and my, you know, the rest of my family. So it was an important thing that I grew up with. But it's also something that I've struggled with, because I think my barbaric nature really rejects this notion of forgiveness. You know, and most of the time I have to actually rein myself in and say, okay, you have to forgive. But my instincts most of the time is actually like, you do something to me, I'll put you against the wall and shoot you. You know, that's my natural barbaric instincts. Okay? That's what I'm just talking about. I'm talking about the unsaid. Now, since you also spoke about the unsaid, I'm talking about the unsaid. I'm not talking about what I'm saying. I'm saying what I feel sometimes inside when someone crosses a particular line. Obviously, there is there. But what was interesting was that, which I say in the document, is that, you know, because I had this imagination growing up in the rural area with my grandmother's stories about Madiba, this revolutionary, this hero who was going to come marching in the streets and defeat the enemy and everything else. And I think I was stuck in that memory. And I was stuck in that age of being a child. So when I saw him come out of prison, I actually couldn't imagine, I couldn't believe it was the same person that my grandmother spoke about. You know what I mean? Because he was old, he had grey hair, and I was stuck in the image of my childhood, of this young man, you know, who was a revolutionary and everything, you know, from those stories. So I think it was this kind of, that's what I'm trying to do with the document. I'm trying to sort of, that's why originally before BBC changed it into Nelson Mandela, the myth and meat, was a letter to Nelson Mandela. You know, because it was that kind of thing, like a son or a grandson talking to the grandfather and saying, this is how I imagined you. You know, like an absent grandfather who would one day rock up, and you've had stories and he doesn't sort of match what you imagined, you know? And that was it. It wasn't a critique. I mean, I hear people go, you're not so critical of him after all. That wasn't even the purpose. The purpose was my own imagination as a child, and how sometimes I was so traumatized by him and the anger, the lack of anger. I mean, I remember watching him at the stadium on TV, and I was like, where's this anger? Because my grandmother told me he was a revolutionary, angry, everything. I was like, oh my God, this is a different human being. And I thought either my grandmother lied to me, or I have, but because memory is also, you know, memory is unreliable too. So, you know, and it's an interesting thing. The French filmmaker, Louis Malle, talks about this thing where he goes, he was writing a film script about how the Nazis were coming into Paris and they took over Paris and he witnessed them. And he went to his mother and he said to his mother, you know, I'm writing this script, can you read it? Because it's about my recollection of the Nazis coming into Paris. And the mother said, but Louis, you're not in Paris at that time. You're in the countryside with your uncle. You know? And then he went to his sister. He says, my mother got it wrong. She thinks, you know, with old age, she thinks that I wasn't there with the Nazis. I remember the detail. And he started describing everything. The sister said, no, but Louis, you're with our uncle. You know what I mean? So that's what's really interesting. If you're talking about memory, this memory is interesting in terms of what it remembers, how it chooses to remember, what it decides to forget, whether it's intentional. You know, when you hear people in the early 90s saying, oh my God, during the Truth Commission say, I didn't know it was that bad. It's the first time I see, oh my God, these things were happening, you know? Like it's an interesting thing, memory, I think, and it's something that I revisit and visit again in my work. Even in the state of violence, I go back to memory, a man who has forgotten. I think it's something that really has become very interesting and part of my own expression.
Thank you. Jihan, a question for you. The film Behindthe Rainbow was, I guess, also kind of trying to understand the kind of development of the ANC, and we also kind of, in one of the breaks, spoke about the notion of populism. Of course, there is something that has shaped the ANC to a large extent, but it's also that we're seeing a re-emergence, for example, with the Economic Freedom Front, that I also think touches on that. Do you have a particular perspective on that, looking at these two movements?
I'm not going to compare the two because, I mean, initially I got interested in telling the story of the ANC, not because it's the ANC. For me, it was an example of the last surviving revolutionary movement of the 60s. And you could actually see that moment of transition live, which I'd missed in the 60s. And I think what was really interesting about it is that dream. These movements, and the ANC being one of them, you can compare it to the FLN, you can compare it to all the other liberation movements, that have this dream, and everybody, including Khalo via his grandmother, adhere to that dream and the elements of that dream and become part of our reality. And for me, what was interesting was trying to spot where's the point where you lose that dream. And it's somewhere in the process of trying to reconcile this transformation from a liberation movement to a ruling party, because suddenly you actually have to rule. And when you rule, you have to chuck out part of that dream. And also to elaborate just a minute on what Khalo was saying, part of this was the construction of mythologies. Moving into the new era, every country constructs its own mythology. And what was very interesting while I was making this film was the ANC was still in flux. They hadn't consolidated exactly what their own mythology was about. So you'd speak to people and suddenly the Cowboy Conference was this and that. And you'd speak to someone else who was there at the same time speaking about the same event, and it'd be something completely different. So being an outsider, I thought that this dynamic of a nation trying to establish the space it's in for its future was fascinating to watch it live unravel. And I think to get to the EFF, that's part of that same dynamic. Because, I mean, I don't want to get into the specifics, but Julius Malema is partly the brainchild of whatever that populist vision of what Zuma was all about. So, I mean, sometimes I look at it, he was like a test balloon. He started off as a test balloon. What if we start addressing these issues now, which were part of that former dream? And then it got out of hand. But I think what's interesting, and I think it was addressed earlier this morning, is how the institutional structures then rally around this new vision of what the country is and where it's going. And it becomes a reality that we can't question anymore, except in these little, when we talk about public culture, then there are these little moments of films, of little, even some graffitis on the wall, where suddenly the question is posed. And again, to come back to Khalo, everyone I knew too said, no, ANC, it's over now, they have to be contested. And each and every one of these people, when you ask them, well, who did you vote for? They say, well, what else can I do? You're in a space where options, and I personally think that it's part of this moment of transition. I mean, 20 years is very short. It's very long, but it's very, very short in terms of nation building. So that moment of flux, that moment of transition, we're still in the heart of it. And an alternative has not yet appeared on the scene. And that's why you keep coming to this, who has the final word? The final word, I think, and again that's interesting, is the rural population, who we never listen to, or not part of our social networks. I have a clue if I even touched on your question.
No, thank you. And I just want to pick up on something that I maybe missed earlier in my introduction. Then, if we speak about public culture, then we should also speak about public space, which, as we know, is highly contested. And I want to come back to the metaphor of the theatre. Then, you know, what constitutes then public space, where this public culture is performed in, or happens in, or lived in, or breathed in? And maybe to jump a little bit again, Pumla, you have written quite extensively on the work of Zanele Moholi and also Sempiwe Dana, who are artists that are both, I think, very politically engaged. And I'm also interested then in how public space becomes visible from, I would imagine, relatively rarefied environments, for example, the art gallery, into larger public spaces. And if you perhaps can give your views on this process and how it works.
I think this is on. I think that, thank you for that question, Storm. I think that, you know, you're right, when we're talking about kind of public culture, I think, you know, without kind of resorting to the kind of academic cliche, we really should probably talk about public cultures. Because I mean, it's a very layered senses of publicness, right? So there's kind of official public cultures, and there's kind of highly circulating, somewhat ruling narratives about who we are and who matters and who does not matter, and so on. And then there are, you know, then there kind of more fluctuating kind of narratives around that are equally public. So, for example, if you think about kind of official government narrative about health, right, or about education, or about citizenship, it is, in one sense, as public as something like Guaido is, right? In terms of the largeness of that space, they both highly visible, highly subscribed. Thank you. Highly subscribed spaces, but at the same time, and in many ways, they're both very powerful kinds of spaces. But as soon as I say they're very powerful spaces, I also have to talk about how that power actually functions in very kind of different ways. And I think part of what is incredibly striking to me about contemporary South African public culture is the almost dismissive attitude towards the imagination, right? Which is very interesting to me. And when I say the imagination, I'm speaking in this case specifically around kind of the creative imagination, whether it's popular cultural, subcultural, or fine arts and literature and music. So I'm not interested in whether, you know, I'm speaking about both kind of high cultural forms and kind of low cultural forms. But there's this kind of very dismissive sense about what happens in creative spaces. What matters is policy and you know, policy and legislation and all of these things. And it's very striking to me because we see some of this kind of dismissive attitude, for example, in, you know, every time we go to vote, there's some anxiety about who the Minister of Arts and Culture is going to be. And kind of, you know, election after election, there are throwaway comments about, oh, you know, we didn't know what to do with so-and-so, so we just gave them the Arts and Culture Ministry, right? So the sense of kind of the creative arts as something that really doesn't, that's what you do with people that you can't completely throw away, but you really sort of want to throw away. So it's kind of a dustbin of official politics, right? And of course, but of course, if it's the dustbin of official politics, it also tells you something quite revealing about how we think about the creative arts, about how we think about the imagination. which is very strange to me, someone who studies kind of the creative arts, right, in South Africa historically and in the contemporary moment, because it seems quite bizarre to me that a country that has spent decades talking about how absolutely crucial the imagination is to the project of freedom, right? So whether you wanted to call it protest art or the various names that were given to kind of revolutionary creative forms that were deliberate, that were seen as important in and as of themselves, but important also to the project of freedom. So this kind of sense that the imagination is foundational to freedom, right? You have to be able to imagine ourselves anew, but we also, the creative arts are crucial to that project of imagining and bringing about a material freedom as well. So on the one hand, we have this history, and it's not just the apartheid history, but it's a history certainly that we see, you know, even in late colonial, in the first missionary educated, but in also kind of the colonizers movement. So we have a long tradition of a kind of a deliberately, unapologetically kind of recognition that the imagination is very political and very important and crucial to the project of freedom. So it seems so, and then we have this, I suppose we could call it paradox that in South Africa that says, well, I mean, it's just kind of escapist. It's not important. It's that, you know, the ministry is not important, but the arts themselves are they find to kind of entertain yourself, but they're not really the space that we have to take as seriously as we have to take Marxist analysis, that as we have to take economic policy, as we have to take, and I'm not saying those things are not important. Right? I'm not saying structural things are not important, but what I'm saying is, you know, I'm interested in what it means and what this anxiety is suddenly in a free, in a democratic country around the place of the imagination. And I think that part of the anxiety, honestly, is about the fact that we haven't forgotten just how disruptive the imagination is and can be. And so there's this anxiety about, you know, we can't, it has to be the dustbin of history because we can't accord it the power that we know it has and can have. And at the same time, we don't completely want to disown the people we were when we did value and recognize how important imagination is too. And so it's this kind of bizarre duality. And I think, I think artists like, like Zanele and Siphiwe are particularly interesting because they in many ways suggest something, a range of seemingly counterintuitive things about South African society. You know, it's the same way that someone like Mashiya works, for example, right? So the part of the public discourse in South Africa is that we which is not untrue, which is not entirely untrue, is that there's this rising violent masculinities and all of this. But at the same time, there's something about, we can't account for both the rise in violent masculinity in South African public culture and the possibility of feminist television. So, for example, in a TV series like Latitude, right? Prime time, for a long time while it was showing, by far it had a larger viewership than Generations on South African television. I'm interested in what it means to live in both this country that has rising masculinities and a country that has a feminist television program be the most popular. And I'm not satisfied with saying, oh, it's a contradiction, we don't know what that is. I don't know if I answered your question.
I mean, I'm kind of wanting to maybe drill down just a little bit on, I mean, can you drill down a little bit more than what the space is where somebody, and maybe another kind of opposing example to what you're saying here, or getting at, because I think, so yes, the role of the artist then within public culture, so the filmmaker, whatever. But I'm also interested what happens when, you know, the rarefied world of the contemporary art world in South Africa, for example, spills into other conversations, and maybe the most obvious, more recent example would be the work The Spear by Brett Murray and Goodman Gallery,